right. Hello, everyone. We're here to talk about world weaving, as he said, and specifically we're going to talk about how to avoid info dumps and strategies for getting your world building into the story without having those huge passages that put everybody to sleep. So my name is Laya V. Smith. I'm a writer. I write noir fiction, fantasy, romance. This is my book that's out right now, The Lumber Mill. And I'm going to go ahead and let our panelists introduce themselves before we get started. Devri, would you like to go first?
Sure. My name is Devri Walls. I am a young adult fantasy author. I have published 8 novels about every way you can think to do it. My current work in progress is the Venator series. Book 3 came out a few months ago, working on book 4. I author coach. I also teach voice lessons, and then, try to take kids places. And that is my life.
All right, Max?
Sure. My name's Max Florschutz. I'm science fiction fantasy author. Also, imagine that. Also 8 books, actually, coincidentally. I've done quite a range of genres. Science fiction, fantasy. I did a fantasy western called Shadow of an Empire. I tend to also write large epics. So when you want to talk about weaving things in for info dumping, I've had a lot of practice with that when you do a 300 or 400,000 word book. My most recent was actually a YA fantasy. I'll hold it up here. I don't know why it's backwards, but whatever. It's called Axterra, Banking and Finance, and it's about this dragon who decides she wants to open a bank rather than do the usual fantasy thing. Amazing amount of fun, and I'm actually going to be talking a bit about it tonight because there are a lot of I use my clever tricks to weave the exposition into everything in there. I also do a writing series on my website, Being a Better Writer, and so I've talked about that there as well. So I'll probably drop that in the chat, but that's me.
Excellent. And then we have MK.
Yeah, I'm Megan. I write under MK Hutchins. I have 2 novels out, so we square that. And then, anyway, the latest, I don't have a copy of on hand, is the Redwood Palace, and it's a YA fantasy with food magic book. And the sequel to that is coming out this summer. I've also written a lot of short fiction. I've been published in Analog and Strange Horizons and Podcastle, and I've also done tie-in fiction for Fantasy Flight's Keyforge games.
All right. Excellent. Before we get too much into the actual weaving, do you have any general tips that make for effective world building, like kind of your pre-world building before you get started on the novel?
The people who follow my site are going to laugh because they hear this one a lot, but always do the research. It doesn't, if you are writing about fishing boats in the Atlantic, if you are writing about any topic, corsets in the 18th century, whatever, do the research. It will help your world. Not only does it give you ideas and get your brain working, but believe me, if you write something that is incorrect because you didn't do the research, even if it's fantasy, someone's going to call you out on it. So before you can write any information into your story, you need to know your information. So one of the first things I always tell people is do your research. Don't, I'll just take a shortcut and assume I know it. Find it. Read about it. Internet makes that amazing.
I think my piece of advice that I always like to offer, just as kind of my standard, is so it's okay. Sorry, I'm like, it sounds a little weird, so I'm like, how fast can I explain this? Don't apologize to your readers. And what I mean by that is people, especially fantasy writers, have a tendency to do these info dumps in the front. And it really is a form of an apology. Like, they're like, I know this is really super, but if you'll just stick with me, like, it all makes sense because 300 years ago, and then they go into this whole big thing. And it's completely unnecessary if you just write it like it is. And the example that I love to give for that is George R.R. Martin. So if you look at his first book, it's very War of the Roses. It's historical, it reads like historical fiction. And then he's like, oh, and zombies. And you're like, wait, what? He's like, zombies, let's go. And you're like, okay, zombies. And then, a little bit later, he's like, and dragons. And you're like, George, come on. And he's like, dragons. and we go, because he writes it confidently, and that's the world. And so that's my first piece of advice to give people is write it like you know it, believe it, and your readers will go with you.
I'm also a big fan of research, and we could talk for a long time about corsets. I have opinions and feelings. But I think it's also important to take your ideas and think about them. When I was a kid, around the dinner table, we played a game called Pluses, Minuses, and Interesting Points. And I think that's a really good thing to do with all of your ideas, like pros, cons, like how would this play out? How does this affect this group of people or this group of people? And just spend time with the idea and brainstorm the implications thereof.
All right. Good advice. So how much world building do you think becomes too much?
That's like it's no hard and fast rule, right? It all ties into pacing. It all ties into what does the reader have to know at this moment exactly. So yeah, it's going to be a case by case thing. Does someone have specific thoughts? And
I would say that there's two areas. This question for me divides into two sections. One is before you start writing the book. If you are not pantsing and you're planning things out, too much work, because it's okay. Don't get me wrong. It is really cool to do a deep dive on the currency system of your world and figure out why they use the various things they use. This can be a lot of fun. But the moment you go past the point where it will become useful, and you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, you're probably not spending your time on anything useful. You can go a little bit past that edge, but if you just dig into it, you're losing writing time. When it comes to the book, anything that doesn't serve the needs of the story or the setting, if it doesn't have a purpose in either establishing your setting or your characters or bringing that world to life, probably can cut it. You don't really need it in there. But if it adds anything at all, you can go for it.
So that like preliminary world building can kind of become a form of procrastination sometimes.
Oh
yes. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
I have seen people do that. I'll get working on it, but I've got 35 pages on how this one treaty happened, and I'm like, are you even writing about that? Well, it's an important part of the backstory. No, it's not anywhere. Why are you doing it?
Yeah.
But you can get so excited and caught up in an idea, though.
Yeah, I think be careful with so I think Max is exactly right on if it's necessary to the story, it needs to be there. If it's not, it doesn't need to be there. But you also need to listen to your readers, because fantasy writers, I love all of your faces so much. You're adorable. But all fantasy writers, we all do it. We have a tendency to think all of the things are important, right? And I have gotten into the hugest arguments at like Comic-Con. Well, not arguments, discussions with fantasy writers after a panel, and they'll be like, well, but I have to have this thing. And I'm like, you don't. And they're like, well, but because, and you really don't. And so listen to your readers. Like if you have 5 people telling you that we actually didn't need all of this information, you might not actually need all that information quite as much as you thought you did.
So whenever someone says like, oh, there's too much world building, or this is an info dump, what they're really saying is I'm bored.
Mm-hmm.
You can have all the world building you want in a book. You just have to make it interesting and relevant to the reader. So they're like, oh my gosh, we finally get this part. Sherlock Holmes is going to explain how everything happened. Sherlock, like the mystery thing where the person goes like, blah, 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 blah. Like it's a giant like info dump, but it's also not, because you're there for it. So like when someone complains like, oh, this is too much world building, that's a flavor of boredom in your novel that you need to fix.
That's perfect. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. So kind of on the other side, how much do you think an author needs to know about the world that they've built versus how much actually ends up in the book?
This is my, should I answer that question honestly face? Okay, all right. I will say what I'm thinking thinking because I will be the bad example in the group, and then I will let Megan and Max give you guys awesome advice.
Oh, I don't know. Watch that bar. You might be setting it to where we're just going to trip over it.
hey, meet it. For it. You can do it. So I think there are a lot of things you need to know, and Max was right in that okay, Allison, I'm terrified I was calling him by the wrong name. Max is right in that you do need to figure out kind of what your world looks like and what's going on. I walk in with a lot of things unknown, and it's because I'm a pantser and because I like to leave all of those threads open so that when I hit them, I can have these available options to me that I pull in and I can twist the story. I can do that though. And if you can't do that, oh, for heaven's sakes, don't figure out your stuff before you start. Not a good example.
Well, actually, no, I think you're fine. My only thing with that I'd throw into that is if you're pantsing it and you're making it up as you go along, which you can 100% do, and you can build massive, expansive worlds. It probably serves yourself well to take notes when you do that.
Oh, yeah.
If you're going along and you're writing about currency and you didn't plan it out beforehand, you're just making it up as you go. Write it down so you don't make it up again later and do something completely different. I have made that mistake. I will admit to that. Alternatively, if you're planning, and this is more my area because I tend to do more planning. I'm not as much of a pantser usually. I'll tend to go one step past what the book needs, just in case, so that A, I know the background of why it's there when it's presented in the book. So if somebody asks me about it later, or if someone in the book asks, I can explain it. And B, if the book does suddenly need to go a little bit further, I can take that extra step just by checking my notes, as opposed to sitting there going, "Oh no, how does this tie in with all of this?" And "Oh, what have I done? My mind's not here in this moment in time anymore." So I at one point invented for one story 3 different currency systems and how they interacted with one another, and it was absolutely way too far. But it was handy and kind of a rest assurance for me that I could just look it up if I needed it. So
now I am sure that Megan's going to have the best answer of all of them.
I don't know. Go. Okay, so my background, I went to school for archaeology, so I just love the ever-loving hex out of research. So I think there's there's these 2 different. Ooh, I can make hand gestures on the. There's these 2 different things where there's this is research that I need for this book, and then this is just I'm an engaged human being who enjoys researching things. Period. So, yeah, I've been doing research for this thing, but I did actually yesterday watch a half-hour YouTube video on 500 years of corset history. No one in my current book wears corsets, but I can tell you some really interesting things about Williamsburg, Virginia right now, and corsets and the fashions thereof, and that has no bearing. But ooh, I'm talking really fast. It's weird talking to a camera. There's how much am I going to
I also put a lot of pressure on you. Sorry.
So yes, there's a time to say, I'm going to stop researching this specific thing and go read my book. But there's also this, I'm going to just go enrich my brain with compost for future books, or so that I can be on top of things and think about things, and that I have stuff to draw on later where I'm oh, I don't need to research that. I've already, watched that history video. I know these things. And so just always learning as a person, I think, is really important as a writer. And those things come back. Things I have watched for fun come back in my writing all the time, even if I'm not researching that specific thing. So I think that's important for writers.
Yesterday's keynote was about that. The idea of always being curious and stretching. I did a post on it where I compared it to working taffy. You get taffy on the pullers and it works it back and forth. If you're not exposing your brain to new ideas constantly as an author, you're just going to sit there and congeal. So yeah, 100% research is good for an author.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have a history degree, so I'm right there with you, Megan. Exactly the same sort of process. So I wanted to ask, what do you think are some challenges that are unique to building a fantasy or a sci-fi or a historical based world?
All right, who wants to go first?
I know we all. I've been consistently going first, so I can either continue this trend or let someone else take the floor first. It's totally
I'll take a whack at it.
Okay.
At least for me, I think the biggest challenges for coming up with something like that is fitting all the pieces together. I tend to write epics. I'm currently halfway through the final of a trilogy, and it is 270,000 words, and that's halfway through. That's the kind of thing I do. There are a billion pieces in this story, and when you build a world, there's the real world is incredibly complex, and I find it fascinating. There's just billions of gears, everything meshes together. The wondrous thing about it is that you can make a story about any one of these gears. I mean, if you take any gear out of a watch, the watch goes, and then you have your conflict. But if you're building a world like that, you kind of, A, you don't want to get lost in it, but B, also you need to make something that people aren't going to read and immediately go, well, wait, what about this? That doesn't make any sense. The old phrase ducks in a row, which my mother loved, comes to mind. Like, you have to line up everything and make sure it works, but then you have to start sliding some pieces out of a line so that your readers can, foreshadowing what's coming. Worlds are complicated. So my answer to that with building a science fiction or a fantasy world is just getting everything pulled together for the story you need could be an incredible undertaking and a lot of fun.
I think the thing I see a lot is people are fearful of building worlds in fantasy and sci-fi in a way that they are not in other genres. And I think it's because it's an empty canvas like nothing else is, right? If we write a romance set in Nashville, it's there. We just have to put the plot in Nashville, right? And this is opening a computer or opening a notebook and there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And that's very intimidating for a lot of people. I love it because for me, it's freedom. Like, in that moment, there are no rules yet. I can literally pull anything I want from anywhere and weave it together exactly how I want it. Later I'm locked in and wish that I maybe made a different choice. But in that moment,
that's just like
done.
I know.
Pass me, you fool.
I know. I'm like, and we have to follow these rules. Why? I don't know. I thought it was cool then. It is less cool now. But yeah, I think finding the fun in that, would help with the panic of that blank canvas, is just enjoy the utter childlike creativity that can come with it.
Yeah, you can go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always loved world building. That's my favorite part. So the hardest part about fantasy world building for me early on, I had to have someone point out, Megan, you write a story and then you stop when you finished showing and exploring all your world building. You still need to have a story and it needs to have an ending. I was like, what? Dang it! We covered all of the things I wanted to cover. What's done now? The end. The world building's all there, and they're like, no, finish the story. You set up conflict. Resolve this. So I know it's the other end of things, but that was the hardest part for world building for me. Was oh, right, this world building still needs characters and a satisfying plot wrapped. Oh, dang it!
It's true, and you are not the only fantasy writer that struggles with that. I've worked with some people who, it's they have this enormous world and it's beautiful, and I'm like, but yeah, what's the story? It's cool, but where are we going with this?
Books like that.
Oh yeah,
this was a neat setting, but what?
I'm not a big outliner, but I will now make sure, do I have a climax to this book? Is it going to go somewhere dramatic? Okay, I will sketch out these pieces to make sure I have a story arc here and not just, these are my fun musings about this world. Goodbye.
Yeah. Well, I love, exactly what you said is really important. I want to make sure people didn't miss it, that you actually wrote down the story arc, because a lot of people are like, what do you mean I have a story? Like, look at these 375 pages of stuff. Like, this is a story. And there is a difference between that and a actual story arc that has the climax and all of the things that it's supposed to have. So that was a very important point, and I just wanted to like focus attention a little more to that.
A difference between the minutes of a meeting and the actual scene where someone threw somebody else out of a window over a dispute about lunch.
So that moves into the next question. Well, how do you use character actions and dialogue to build your world?
Oh, it's my favorite tool. I think it's one of the best ways to not info dump, frankly, because it takes it out of paragraph format. You know, we don't have 17 pages of this thing. We have it unraveling very naturally through character observations, through them seeing it, through their emotional attachment to that thing. It becomes part of the story as opposed to just setting.
When you have a strong voice, that brings interest to whatever's happening, and then people aren't bored. I don't know if anyone listening has read Marie Brennan's really excellent A Natural History of Dragons, but it's a secondary world, but like kind of Victorian, and it's the memoirs of this like grumpy old, I give no dangs about anything anymore, like old lady telling her memoirs, and like it's just that like dry Britishy sarcasm that my soul was fed upon as a child, and I love it so much. I would just listen to, she can get away with, oh, let me tell you about the state of, the natural history of dragons as a science when I was 6. And I'm like, I will listen to that forever because it is snarky and sarcastic and understated, and I am thoroughly entertained. So you can do so much by having entertaining characters talk about things.
Right, or characters that are invested in something. This was actually one of the first examples I thought of when I read about the topic. So and this again is, hey, let's also talk about dragons, because this is about my book with the dragon who wants to be a banker. When she arrives at the town in this remote kingdom, she's decided to go in there. You are given what is, if you look at it, it really is an info dump. She arrives at this town and she describes what the town is like. But it doesn't read like that because it's from her perspective, and she's arriving in a town where they clearly have not ever interacted with the dragon, and they're all very unsure, and she's incredibly nervous, but she's also really eager because this is her first impression, and I have to make things right. And so she's observing everything that she can, and so it keeps it from being boring to the reader, because they're like, oh, like at this point they've been with her for 3 chapters, and they're like, oh wow, this is where she's going to live. This is what she's looking at. And so the info dump is disguised basically in the fact that it's a character who's very interested and invested in learning about this town, and her character rides on it. And so, you do that with other characters. The character walks into town and immediately wonders if there's trouble based on what they notice or whatever. And you can lay out what a place looks like or how something functions in a society by being relevant to the character. If it's relevant to the character and to their arc, it's going to be relevant to the readers. And they're not going to gloss over it because this is information they need to know so they can continue on this journey with the character.
Yeah. And you can have a character walk into town and describe, oh, look, there's a carriage and there's a tavern and there's a bank and there's this. Or you can have the character walk in, step into the street, almost get run over by the carriage, have to go into the tavern to get cleaned off from the mud that was spattered from the carriage. Then, and so now you are walking that world with them, and it becomes very natural.
And you can even use it you can do double duty. You can build the world and you can build the character. Because what is this character going to notice first instead of another character? So you can also be educating your reader on what the characters are like at the same time. You can kind of weave it all in a nice little tapestry.
You should always do double duty if you can. Triple if possible.
I think that's great advice. Making sure that it's relevant to your character with the things that they're learning about the world. Because sometimes I think one of the problems with an info dump is it can come off as kind of a, as you know, Bob sort of moment where all the characters already know all of this information. So nobody's learning it. It's not relevant to anything. It's just, here's for you, the reader, this thing that you need to know. And I think that can be one of the things that can make them boring.
This is why Watsons are so popular. The Watson trope, a character who doesn't know what's going on or is out of their element, fish out of water, so that another character can teach them the ropes. You can overuse that, though. I read there's a book, I won't name it, but I really like the author's books. But in one book, there were like 4 main parties the book was following, and every single one of them had a Watson. And it was like, you couldn't have had at least one party where everybody knew what was going on. Like it was constantly, what about this? And then they would explain it. Well, there's just question and answer with everyone. But Watsons are really useful, and used well, you can explain something to the world through a character that doesn't know what's going on either. Like Harry Potter, why do I need an owl?
Right.
Yeah. You have to be really careful. The thing that I say a lot is I don't ever want to see your hands in it. And what I mean by that is, if you have 2 characters talking about something that they would never talk about because it's not weird and it's just their life, they would never have a conversation about this. I can see the author's hands all up in that. I know that the author needs to know that this thing is happening. And I don't ever want to think that. I don't ever want to read a book and think, oh, the author needed me to know this. Figure out a different way.
Right. That's kind of like when 2 characters walk into the room and they're like, "How you doing, sis?" "I'm doing all right, bro."
Yeah, exactly.
the two guards that will always happen to be discussing secret information as the hero sneaks by.
Yeah. I'm going to put on these brown pants that were woven by the dwarfs in the mountain Scenaria. What? You would never say that.
Have you guys seen the Truman Show with the scene with the coffee? Who talks like that? Who are you talking to? That's what it's like to the reader.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, yes, please.
I think
there's always ways to do it. Like, whenever I call someone, like if I'm working with someone and I'm like, yeah, you can't do it. They're like, there really isn't another way. And I'm like, there is always, always a way. You might have to think for a while. There's always a way.
Hang a lampshade on it.
Yeah. That's good advice in any genre, I think.
Yes.
Another example of that is when you have a main character, like they look into a mirror and describe what they look like.
Oh.
Yep. Mm-hmm. My blue eyes are just so dashing today. Yes. Ridiculous.
Unless we have a narcissist. And
I did take pride in subverting that once. I did it in chapter 7, and the only thing she described was a massive scar that she was very self-conscious about.
Well, okay, I'm actually going to give you that one. That one almost works. And the reason is because the only reason it works, that is a huge character statement, because that's what we do as people, especially. And I think women, especially, we have all of these beauty standards that we're told that we need to conform to. And so we pick things and we look in the mirror and that's all we see. Like we see this flaw and nothing else. And that actually does kind of speak to a character's mindset and weakness. And so I think that's actually a good example of an exception.
Right. Like I said, well, it's even better. It's the scar she got when her brother died saving her life on a mission gone wrong. So but it was a complete subversion of what the usual stare in a mirror was, which was why I was so happy with it.
Because you're bringing it into the character's actual head and things that people actually think about themselves when they look into a mirror, rather than going, "Oh, my hair is brown," or
"My eyes are just so blue today.
My eyes are so blue today, and my lips curve just so."
I know, right? I look mysterious yet charming today. Yeah.
Nobody understands me.
Oh man. Okay, we should probably stop bashing the mirror thing. What else we got?
Let's see here. How important do you think accurate science and accurate history is in fantasy and sci-fi world building?
I think it depends whether we're talking sci-fi or fantasy, for starters. I think sci-fi, they're a lot more particular. Fantasy, though, it still has to make sense. Like you can't, there are limits that you cannot cross because it breaks that believability factor, right? The audience will go a long ways with you in fantasy, but if you don't set it up properly, if you don't justify certain things, they will not go all the way. So I know that was a very vague answer, but it really, I think it depends a little bit. But yeah, I would say sci-fi more so, fantasy not so much, but it does make sense.
Okay, it's totally time to bring this back to corsets.
We've done the loop.
I promise. There are loops and corset ties as well. So like it both matters and it doesn't. Like probably many of you have seen the movie Enola Holmes, which like was awesome. But there's a scene where she's getting dressed and she puts on her corset and then her boots. I like screamed at the television. If you've ever worn a corset, like this is really important, people. Put your boots on first. Like, because once you've got that corset on, it's really hard to bend over like that. It's like a giant back brace. Like, this is not like, did you not watch any of the YouTube videos of how to get dressed in like the 1800s? Have you never worn a corset? No. Boots first. It's a thing. Anyway, so like, did that ruin the movie? No. My family had a good time laughing at me as I'm like, no. And they're like, we're going to pause and listen to her freak out about this. So like, it's both important. Like this adds, but it's like, oh, they missed this one detail and it was funny to my family and I still love the movie. So I think you can get overly anxious about getting every detail right, but the details that are plot important to your story should be magnificently like point on. If that were a story about a person who sews corsets, that would be a problem. It's not. So like everyone else was okay and enjoyed laughing at me.
I'm going to try and paraphrase, probably poorly, but something Howard Taylor did in one of his Schlock Mercenary strips, which was, you can't make up rules about stuff I already know. And then that's the challenge. You know, you can make up a lot of stuff. And if you set up the audience beforehand going, hey, here's where this differs from the real world, you're fine. The moment you step into a realm where you are clearly making things up and a good chunk of your audience knows it, it could have a negative impact. I think it's Larry who says that the two you really can't mess with are the gun people, because they know everything about every gun ever made and they will let you know, and the horse people, because they know everything about every horse that ever existed and every saddle and tack, and if you get one bit of it wrong, you will get angry letters. When it comes to science fiction and fantasy, you can handwave a lot. I mean, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But you have to establish those rules and then be consistent. Consistency, I think, matters the most. Like if you want to set up that you're not obeying a rule of physics that we understand today, such as faster than light travel, that's fine. I get away with that all the time with FTL. But you have to keep it consistent. It can't be, well, it took 2 days to do it this time, but 46 minutes the next time. I mean, I don't want to get into ripping on Rise of Skywalker, though it deserves every minute of it. But one of the things that just threw all the rules on faster than light travel from the previous 8 movies out the window with that flick, for convenience of plot. And it was one of those things where I sat there and I was like, wait a minute, but in the other movies, whatever, they clearly don't care either. But if you're going to, and you can make rules about FTL or how to fly or how to do, spells, but you have to be consistent. Even if you're not going to follow reality or the realism of the real world, you still have to be consistent with these things. If you have 2 + 2 = 4 through the entire book, you can't do 2 + 2 = 5 without a darn good reason, and maybe some foreshadowing.
Yeah. And I want to add the one thing you said, because the consistency, absolutely. And you talked about making sure that you setting up things that you do. And yes, 100% make sure that you have things set up. However, there is a difference, and I want to point it out, between setup and excessive apologizing to your reader. We don't have to understand exactly how said species can fly, just that said species can fly, and they can always fly and no one else can, and they can't suddenly not fly for no reason. We don't need to know where their genetics switched 500 years ago, because we as a species we understand there are things that we don't understand, and we're fine with that.
That's a very good point.
Don't feel the need to backstory the bejeebers out of it. Just, this is what it is, and then stick to it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's not what I didn't mean. If I came off that way, I apologize.
No.
That's a very good clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, I know with these, when you're starting as a new writer, there are so many rules that are getting thrown at you all the time. And a lot of times you're trying to keep all of them and it gets very confusing. So I try to clarify if I'm like, that didn't mean that thing though. So no, you didn't come off like that at all.
That kind of reminds me, I think it's one of the Pixar's rules of storytelling, if anybody's seen those, where it has to do with coincidences. And what you were talking about, convenience, I think fits into that same vein, where if it's convenient to, make the plot move along, then that's a big sin against your story. But if you can use your world building in a convenient way that makes it worse for your characters, then that can work out better. Like using a coincidence that makes things harder for your characters rather than using a coincidence that makes things easier for them.
Yeah. Well, it's true because the harder things, that's the point of the story, right? We want to make things as hard as we can for our characters. And even though this probably shouldn't be the case because coincidences do happen for great things, right? We as readers, I think a lot of times tend to look at that as the author's hands a little bit. We're like, oh, sure, it just happened to work out. And I don't know why we react like that to the one and not the other, but we do.
We're dangerously close to going into a giant thing on reality is actually very unrealistic.
Oh, it is. It is.
And that's actually the danger of being really realistic with your world building is if you go too far, realism is often not very real for a lot of people. The source I always cite for that is Audie Murphy, the World War II veteran, who acted in a movie about his own exploits where they toned everything down and still had people who walked, like the movie just was lambasted by critics for being so unbelievably unrealistic because no man could do all that. And he'd actually done a lot more. And it was himself. And they criticized real guns don't work like that. And he's like, I'm a soldier. Like, yes, they do. Reality is unrealistic. And sometimes it's tricky to know what your audience expects compared to what's really real.
Yeah, that's a wormhole. Sorry, rabbit hole. Sorry. Oh my gosh, Megan, go.
No. There's people talk about the Ashley phenomenon too. Like if you have a medieval book and name someone Ashley, people will be like, that's not like, what are you doing? Except like that is an old name. And then things are just messy. Yeah, that was it.
Right. So it can be more important that something seems like it's true than that it actually is true.
It's like being a magician.
Like there are, like in my book is set in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, there were large groups of people, your kind of early beatniks that were called hipsters. But if I call these people hipsters now, they're going to go, there weren't any hipsters around. It's like, that's literally what they were called. But okay, I won't use that word because it doesn't have any verisimilitude. And people won't believe it because they think they know. Like Ashley or Tiffany is another, really old name that you think came into existence in the 1980s.
I'll admit, I actually, with my books, I love to prod readers with this one a little bit. Like, I'll be like, oh, well, here's a name that used to be a man's name back in the 1600s. I'm writing medieval, so there we go. And I always get the one reader who's like, what? But that's a woman's name. I'm like, well, it wasn't then. I like poking that. I can't resist poking the hornet's nest a little when I write. It's like, today you learned something, reader.
Right. I guess if you're gonna make a point of it, then that's all right. But it is interesting how reality can become uncanny when you try to replicate it too closely. Let's see.
That's like a whole, like we could fill 4 panels on that topic. I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'd like to try to take some questions from the audience now, if we have any that are available.
I've been watching the chat. There's they've been posting a ton, so we should have some.
Oh, have you been? I'm like, I don't even know where to look for that. My husband was asking me like, how many people? I'm like, I can't see.
There have
Apparently,
been
I'm
six,
just ridiculous.
there have been
I'm here,
62 new
looking at a
messages
screen.
since we have been very active. They have really enjoyed this, I think. Hello, people.
Thank you for coming. I managed to not yawn the whole time. I'd like to point that out to my fellow panelists who are watching my head split open in the waiting room. Oh my goodness!
Bad. So, sorry.
I know, where did our buddy go?
Is our
Yeah.
producer?
They
you have
have
some-
questions.
Do you have?
I know. Max,
the
what
chat
questions do
open?
you see?
Pick some
Let me
questions
scroll
for
up
us?
here. Everyone, I'm going to scroll up till I get to the line. Let's see what, because I think the moderators pick them. I'm just going to grab the first one I find when I come across it here. Oh, here's one. Favorite fun facts discovered while researching.
Oh man, on the spot, Megan.
Quick, pass the buck.
Which are like the thing I was researching yesterday for no reason because that doesn't go along with my book.
Okay.
The reason we know a lot about colonial Williamsburg, like the style of corsets and the changing of it, is there was a creepy dude who kept a diary and all the time would be like, Miss So-and-so's new stays are the worst. Like, I don't appreciate the way da-da-da-da-da. So there's a creepy dude who kept a journal of what he thought of all the women's stays for like ever. So we have this really complete historical picture of corsetry in colonial Williamsburg because there was a really creepy dude who had strong opinions about the ladies' stays in town.
That is history right there.
That's amazing. That peeping Toms never did anything for you.
So,
Oh, that's amazing.
I just
man.
love research for this reason. That's probably never making it into a book. It still fills my heart with joy.
Do you think
Dude,
when he
that
wrote
could
that,
be a book.
do you think when he wrote that, he realized that one day, like, hundreds of historians would pour over his creepy stalkerish writings?
Oh, that's amazing.
That is what he's now.
Okay, so mine, I figured it out. Thank you for giving me time. And I'm gonna do a shout out to someone while I'm at it. So my friend Alan Johnson, who's doing a whole class tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. on prop weaponry in fantasy. So you all should be there, by the way. I reach out to him a lot for my weaponry research because it gets very tricky. I write a lot of battle scenes. My last book that I did was a gladiator battle scene. Like, it was just, there was so much happening. Gladiators and magic, guys, it's a lot. So he keeps me in check and helps me kind of invent new things. But the worst, he'd read one of my older books, and we were talking about research for the new book and what can and can't happen. And he goes, okay, I have to tell you something. And he's like, so I know this is a trope. I know it's done all the time. He goes, but you can't actually pull a sword from a back holster. Like, it's impossible. And I was like, what? And so I literally, like, I'm sitting in my office and I'm like, oh my gosh, you can't clear this scabbard. Like, it can't come all the way out. Your arm is not long enough. And it's used all the time.
That's because it looks just so, that's rule of cool right there.
So cool.
Real cool.
I know my daughter was like, but I've seen it. I was like, cut shot, baby girl. Like, they shoot from the back. And then when they flip to the front, he's already got it out. You don't actually see it like clear the scabbard. That is the right word, right? Anyway,
Scabbard, yeah.
That was super interesting.
I'm going to say the one that I had to think about it for a second, but one that I went down a pretty good rabbit hole on was I was working on Axterra, and she was securing a loan with a farmer for a greenhouse. And suddenly I was like, wait a minute, what were greenhouses like during the Renaissance period? Because that's kind of what the book is based on, is a Renaissance period in a second world fantasy. And I went down a rabbit hole. I looked up greenhouses in agriculture and horticulture through from like 16th and 15th and 19th century and how they evolved and what, like, I did not know they used to build heat walls in orchards and they would pump them full of smoke in the winter, like, instead of, because glass was even though it was available then, it was just too expensive. So they'd use like brick heat wall. I learned about it. It was very fascinating, but it made the book all the more fun. I spent like 3-4 hours reading up about that. Oh, and then the other one I'll note is one time I did look up the cost of pipe paid by an oil company It was in like this early, it was like 1703 or something like that. I found a receipt on the internet showing how much they had paid in various denominations of currency around the world for steel pipe. And it was perfect for what I was writing at the moment, but that was a fun one to find.
Very
I have a little one that's been on my brain because I did the World War II dogfighting panel this morning. When I was researching fighter aircraft that was used during World War II, I came across the P-38 Lightning. The cockpit used to get so hot that pilots would actually go up in nothing but their underpants and their helmets.
You know,
this is amazing.
I can imagine there are people that would not complain if Hollywood made the movie accurate in that way.
I know, right?
Here come the airmen.
We can take another question.
Okay. Jay Gosling asks, can everyone on the panel please share their Twitters for me to follow? I can help you guys get to the chat for that afterwards. Linz asks, how do you avoid info dumping before an action scene if the world building is needed to understand the action? If you don't get that world building info out there before the action scene and instead intersperse the info in the action scene, won't it jam the action up and stop the flow of the tension?
That is actually a way bigger question than it appears that it is.
Yeah.
I can take a shot at it.
Yeah. I was gonna say I've got a couple of things. Max, did you want to go first?
If you're ready to go, no, I'm fine.
Okay. So couple of things. First, you want to describe everything that you possibly can before we get there. I assume by the way you worded the question that you don't feel like that is a possible thing. So my first word of advice would be just to reevaluate that assessment first, make sure that is correct. If there isn't something that you can do, a scene you can add, something that will allow it to naturally unravel. But in addition to that, there is things I write, it's fine. There are things that you can unravel and unveil during a fight scene, because pacing in a fight scene is not uniform. If you want it to be interesting, the pacing cannot continue at a solid beat, right? We can't have it just fight. That's boring. It's not sustainable. Also, the tension is too high and your reader can't withstand it. We get tired. That's why movies constantly have breaks and the pacing goes fast, slow, fast, slow, fast, slow. So there are absolutely times during that fight scene that you can get a little more information in. You time it during those slower periods when your hero or your person who's fighting is going to be able to be more aware of the situation. Maybe he got kicked down. Maybe he just stabbed someone, and you get that time slowing thing. There are moments that can do it. So that's like a huge pacing presentation. But yes.
I'll add to that if the fight is the very first thing you're doing, and you can't work it in beforehand, just let your reader be in the dark. That's what The Matrix did. I remember when my father first saw The Matrix, like he just couldn't stop talking about the opening scene because he's like, I had no idea what was going on, but I couldn't look away. This woman's running around on walls, like sending people flying, and he's like, it's completely. I have no idea how she's doing it. Clearly, there's something to it. I did that with Shadow of an Empire. When Shadow of an Empire starts with a shootout, and it shows off the various magics, but it's left to the reader to kind of be like, oh, this is what's going on. And it makes it interesting because they don't know what's going to come next. And then as the fight slows out, like, and fleshes itself out after the immediate gunfight is over, they're like, oh, that's how he did this. That's how that worked. And they think back. You can always it never hurts to assume that your readers are intelligent enough to figure it out.
Yeah. I have one more thing I'm going to add, but I want to let Megan go first.
I think if you can take that information and make it a feature of the fight scene instead. My favorite fight scene info dump is The Princess Bride, and we learn in the most wonderful and dramatic fashion possible that he is not left-handed. Like, ooh, that's so good.
That's a good example.
Think about your like world building that you need to need to put in. And like Devri's been talking about it, don't make it this apologetic slip. Like, see if you can make that a feature. See if you can make that exciting or fun, or have the reader be like, ooh, I wonder if, and then confirm later. And then they can be like, I was so smart, I called that. Or, you know, dramatic, like the hand reveal.
Yeah.
And they go back and forth, and it's like, oh my gosh, that made the scene. They could have told you beforehand. They didn't. It like comes out, and it's just the best.
Yeah, that is an awesome example. That was perfect. To tie into one of the things that Max said, your readers will give you a certain amount of leeway. It will expire. There will come a point where they won't let you go anymore. But you have to judge that too. And as I hate using my own writing as an example, but it's like this particular one. I have in book one, there's a dragon fight chasing scene. And unfortunately, I had a shifter in the mix. So the obvious question my reader's going to ask is, why doesn't the shifter turn into a dragon and just solve this whole little problem right now? I did not have time in that book, in that pacing sequence. I could not explain the ins and outs of his ability. It would have jacked everything up. And the reality was it wasn't totally necessary that we understood the why. We just needed to understand that he couldn't. And so I had the character ask the obvious question is, hello, can we just like turn into a dragon? That'd be great. And as he's running down the fire line, the shifter just yells back like, not a good idea. And that's all he says. And we keep going. And the reader and my editor, completely fine. I did not explain it in book 2. Halfway through book 3, my editor was like, wait a second. Why can't he do these things? And I was like, 100 more pages, sister, I got you. And she's like, okay, as long as it's coming in this book, then I have been totally fine with waiting that long. So it's individual situations, but yeah, they will give you a little time on some things if you set it up properly.
We have quite a few more questions. We'll get through a few. I don't know if you guys want to run long, but you're welcome to join the chat and answer some later on. Emma Spencer asks, how do you include the little details that make a world believable without going full Tolkien 20-year-long world building?
Character asides, I love little details. They make a world come to life. Like, one I always use with some people was from a video game. You walk into a room and there's butterflies and a ray of light, but it's one of the first things you see, and it just makes the place feel real. Little details are great, but they don't have to be huge. They can just be a character, stepping into a town, and the first thing they notice is, man, it smells like there's horse crap everywhere. One line, one observation from the character that's in line with that character, and it just brings a world more to life.
Yeah, I think people think that you have to do way more than you do. A comment here, a small detail there, a detail at the first of the scene, the mid scene, and the end of the scene, and they feel like you've given them this massively rich environment, which you did, but you did it subtly and delicately and one tiny bite at a time, so they didn't really notice what you were doing.
I think something that helps me with those little world building details is tying them to the 5 senses that you want to do when you're doing the description. Like Max mentioned, this place smells like this, and just your characters experiencing their world through their senses and adding in some of those little world building things that are coming through to them as they do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think based on your plot and character, like pick which things you want to give grade A level attention to. My most recent book has food magic, and the main character is a chef. So like all the smells and tastes and the food, like there's a lot of detailed food. Whereas like the clothing, I describe the clothing, but I don't go into the process of like what it is made out of or how it's woven. The only like technical detail there is they mention like, oh, only the palace has a loom wide enough to weave the king's clothes. So it's not like super detailed. So it's like, oh, that got like C level attention, and like So pick which things, like this is important to my story or this is important to my characters, and I'm going to nail that, and it's going to be so detailed and rich, and people are going to come back and say, Megan, like, I'm hungry now. Also, that vomit scene was too vivid for me. Also, still hungry. Like, so, like, pick those things. Pick those. I write good vomit scenes. Yeah.
Everyone's got a skill.
You need to
Write
have
what
that
you
on
know,
a book
man.
somewhere. Write's good.
I do. I'll make a bookmark sometime. My friends make fun of me. They're like, Megan, there's a vomit scene in this book. I'm like, I didn't even realize that, but it's there. But yeah, so like pick which things are important and do those really, really well. And then the fact that like, oh, these other things have less detail won't be as important. Like it will still feel rich and real.
Okay, this has nothing to do with the question, but all I want is for somebody out there to make Megan a shirt that says, I write good vomit scenes. That's all I want from tonight. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I hope I pronounced this name correctly. Joyu says, how do you work out how much world building is required for a short story?
Oh. You're speaking to some fantasy writers.
No.
Can you define short, please? Is that like 30,000 words?
Megan, can you actually help with this? Because I don't know that Max and I are good candidates for this question.
I published tons of short stories. So with a novel, you have time to like go through and explore all the nuances. And with a short story, you still want to have really rich world building, but you get to more imply the other corners and edges of the room. Like instead of talking about the cuisine, you mentioned that there are tomatoes, and that instantly like, oh, tells me all these things about culture. So with short stories, a lot of things have to be kind of implied or dropped, and you don't get to, have 10 songs of the elves, but those things get to still be there and still inform the world. You just have to be more careful and extra deliberate about it, almost like writing poetry. You can't waste any words. Every little detail has to do double or triple duty to help bring your world to life and imply all the places that your reader can't go, so that when they finish, they feel like, oh my gosh, there's so much more here. I've been in this small space, but there's this big space around it, and being really careful with the details you choose, and using concrete details helps so much to build that up. And since we're on it with world building, short stories are such a wonderful place to practice world building. I feel like I can world build concisely in novels because I've done it so many times in short stories. And with short stories, you can practice world building so many different worlds and introducing characters to it. I have 2 books out, but I've published more than like 30 short stories, which is 30 times I've had to quickly introduce readers to new worlds. So read short stories. They're so good for this. Sorry, that's like a whole nother panel or class.
That was such a good answer, though. That was really, I think helpful. Yeah.
I'll say we trust that one there because short and I don't mind.
Okay, Heather asks, what are your techniques on how to layer in new or changed world-building elements after the first draft is done? Interpret this question any way you like.
Oh, easy peasy, man. I'm always amazed at how easy that is. Like, I always think it's going to be such a disaster and it's going to be so difficult. And then it really isn't. Book 1 in the Venator series, I added a character 3/4 of the way through that wasn't supposed to be there. And I also added a dragon that was not in the plans to be there ever.
World
which
needs more of
changed,
those.
but it changed a lot of things because when you add something like that, I had to then check that addition of that dragon against all of the magic systems, against who was scared of who and why, and did this alter the power dynamic, and why could he not go here? Was this strong enough? And so I had to go back through and add both sightings of characters, tweak magic systems, add different protections against this and that. But it really, when you go to do something like that, it's 1 line here, 2 lines there, 4 lines there. As long as you know what you're trying to weave, it's a surgeon. Like, you just go in and it's inserting exactly where you need it to be, and it's kind of fun and way less work than you think it's going to be.
Okay, Devri gave you a nice minimalist answer. Oh, if I have something where I'm like, oh, I really need to like check this and make sure it's like all clean, or I'm changing the voice a little bit, I'll retype the entire manuscript. Because going through and changing lines, I'm lazy, and I'll like, oh yeah, that's fine. And then retyping it, my brain is like, you can do that better and more succinct. And it's now the lazy thing to do it more succinct, because I'm retyping it. And so I like, that's, I guess, extra mode, but I have done that with various problems in manuscripts where I'm like, here's one window, here's a blank window, I'm going to retype the whole thing to clean it up.
I'm amazed that this was the lazy answer, frankly. Like, I was like,
that doesn't sound like it to me.
We retype it. Here's the thing, though. I actually love that you said that, because when I do my author coaching, I've a couple times had to say to people, like, I know you aren't going to want to hear this, but you probably should just retype it. And the reason is for some reason, depending on the author, you need to know what you can and can't do. You need to know where your limits are. You need to know where you're going to be lazy. But when you go in, when some people, and I am one of these people sometimes, when you go into an old work, you think, oh, I'm going to elevate it, right? Like, I'm going to get in and I'm going to make it this better thing. And that's not a lot of times what happens. Instead, it's like, you are here on now, this is your work in progress that you're working on. And when you go in, it kind of meets in the middle sometimes. And if you retype it, it pulls it all the way up to where you are currently. So I think, as hard as it is, that is a really great piece of advice that could be very useful for people.
All I have to add is Control F in Word is your friend. But I'll agree with what you said about it being hard. It's easier than it sounds to just go slip something in. I've done that a few times, and the first few times I was terrified this was going to be a huge amount of work. It was actually fairly straightforward. Control F did make it easier, though.
A kind of middle of the road option. I like to have my story on a different medium, like print it out and then go through and add my revisions in with a pen, and that just forces me to look at it in a different way, and it helps not wanting to retype the entire thing, but it does help me look at it a different way and see problems with it that I wouldn't see if it was still on the computer screen.
Yeah. And I'm a big proponent. See, you type it, I read it out loud, like, repeatedly until everything's smooth and flows and the details are balanced with the dialogue and I have enough scene description. And that book gets read out loud over and over and over. And
reading out loud is really good advice, especially for dialogue. It helps so much.
It is after... It does. I apologize.
What?
It is after 9:00, and there are about half a dozen more questions. Would you guys like to continue, or would you like to just try to answer those in chat?
I'm game.
I'm going to continue, and it is 2 hours past my bedtime, peeps, so this is how much I love you. Okay.
Well, I have to go put children to bed, so I'm going to...
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice job moderating. Thanks.
All. Thank you.
Are the other two of us good to stay?
And then there were 3.
Yes, let's keep going.
We're good.
Zala asks, do you have any special systems or tips for keeping track of your world building stuff in a way that doesn't require you to have 10 notebooks and 15 different spreadsheets open at the same time?
No.
Go back. Oh, no!
I'm joking. I'm kidding.
My God, it's so good.
Yes and no. I actually do have several files.
Oh my gosh.
But generally I just organize things. I keep little bits of paper on my desk with notes that I need to remember. But I also keep a lot of it in my head. And I know that's kind of weird and unique. So, but it again, this depends on, again, I'm talking about writing 460K epic stuff. So there is a lot to keep track of, and I've just kind of resigned. I organize it very nicely. It's always easily accessible to me. I use Google Drive to keep track of it, and it's all like hierarched and everything, so I can go right where I need to. But I do have with the book I'm working on now, which is like the end of a 1.5 almost million word trilogy. There's quite a bit of extra material for me to sort through that I've had to carefully organize and keep track of. So unfortunately, I don't have the best answer. But unless you're planning to write something that's that massive, you can probably get away with a lot less. Let's see what they have to say.
So I still have a lot to integrate into what I have found. I have so much stuff I need to add, so I don't want to come across like I have this all like sitting pretty quite yet. But I found Scrivener was actually a really great tool for me for the World Bible. I found a template online that another author had done. So it allowed me, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Scrivener, but what it allowed me to do is I have like, there's a tab and it'll have a character. So like Gray, and I will click Gray and it'll drop down, and the author provided templates of like body type and backstory and whatever. And so I can throw whatever I want in there and then put all the little details. So I can click his name and then I click the next thing and it'll be like height, weight, blah, 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 blah. And then there's also different sections where I can like alphabetize. So magic systems, and then it'll have like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then I can click, whatever type of thing I'm looking for to get the tiny little details that I threw in half thinking it was cool and now having to deal with it in the next book. So Scrivener has been the best thing that I have found to have it be easily accessible and not in notebooks spread all over my house, which I have absolutely done. And you always think you'll know where it is, and you never do.
There's a software called Plotter, which is Plottr. And I don't use that as much for like the big world building stuff, but it has a really nice way to keep track of like character names and places. And then I can make notes to myself about like, these are the names of the button shops in town. And that's really helped me be able to have those tabs and organize things. So I primarily use that for like plotting. The other stuff is nice. Also, it is totally valid to just have notebooks all over the house, or to the Word document that's 22 pages and staple it together and highlight the parts you're always searching for.
I'm impressed you can find them, because I'm telling you what, I don't even know how many notebooks I've bought, and I never have the one I need ever. So good on you.
I have a 12-year-old who's good at finding things. I can't find them. He can though. So
Laurels and Roses asks, when you have a variety of books and worlds you're creating, do you Brandon Sanderson them into a Cosmere, or do you have techniques to make sure each world is distinct and separate without collision?
I mean, I guess that's a personal preference, so I assume you're asking us. Mine are distinct. They don't overlap at all.
Same here. I've had people ask me this before, actually, because I get compared. I'll say that. I guess I can see why. But no, that would just be a preference. If you want to do that, if you're going to try and set that up, good luck. It's going to take a lot of careful work. Brandon has put a lot of time into that. I haven't done that. The most I've done is I've got set universes I play in. I've got my unusual stories, my stories set on Indrum, the new one with Axterra, which has the book and two short stories. And but I've had people ask, well, does Colony tie into Shadow of an Empire? I'm like, no, not at all.
I I think there's also a middle ground here between like everything's actually interconnected and absolutely I have no overlap, which is like the Hayao Miyazaki thing where everything he does has really cool flying machines and it's just this hallmark of Hayao Miyazaki movies and it's awesome. So I don't worry too much that my books tend to have both like vomit and obsidian in them. Like those are just things I do. And it's okay that like these things show up again and again and again. It's like the Hayao Miyazaki thing. These things are things that interest me. I'll make them different each time. All the Hayao Miyazaki flying machines are great, but those worlds aren't necessarily interconnected. That is generally what I do.
That's just, at that point, that's just author appeal. It's something that, and the thing is if you do have something like that, like Miyazaki does with airships, turns out the people that watch his movies like the airships usually.
Oh, yeah, and he does such cool things, and it's cool not just because like, ooh, here's an airship. You're like, oh my gosh, that's a different airship than this airship. That's different than this airship, and like, ooh, all the shiny airships. I love it.
Jay Gosling asks, how much of the world building is decided why things are the way they are, and how much is decided something happened and then you figure out why?
Can you read that for me one more time?
That one is a little different. How much of the world building is decided? I think she means first why things are the way they are, and then you have the story, or something happened and that's why things are the way they are.
I think this is really a plotter versus pantser kind of question. Like, oh, this is the world building I set up and I'll set this up. And on a book I was working on recently last year. Anyway, I was talking to my husband and I'm like, this part's boring. I don't know what to have happen. And he's like, explosions and pirates are always good. And I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, pirates. There are now pirates in this book. So because of a plot problem, I was then like, oh, yeah, okay, now I need to figure out how those fit and pull it back. So that's like world building before and world building after. And I think that all has to do with how, like what you need for your plot. If you plan everything really well ahead of time, then you're not making up on the fly. But if you're just like, I'm just going to go for it, here's a few things and I'll pull it together later, then a lot of it's like, oh, right, I said that in that scene. Why are things that way? Why do they use this currency? Or, oh, no, I have to think about that and add that back in. But I think both of those things are valid. It's just when and how you're doing your world building practice. And if it's before, during, or after your first draft or second draft, third, seventh.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to go with her take on what that question meant. So I'm going to just continue that train because I thought it was great. I'm going to just offer caution because you're right. It's preference and do whatever you want to do. Make sure that it's something that fits with your writing style. Depending on how big of a story we're talking, when you start doing the Panstein thing where you have an event happen and then that triggers more world and plot and you have to explain it and you're doing so after the fact, it is significantly more difficult to tie together pieces of books you've already published than to have understood that beforehand. So make sure that you are the type of person who can get yourself out of that hole you just dug and not someone who should probably make sure that everything is falling in line and smooth from start to finish before you kind of get going.
I actually don't have anything to add here. I think you both covered it well. I'd just be restating something you said. So you two covered it wonderfully.
Okay, moving along. Heather asks, what do you think about intersecting tiny slices of your worlds in different books, i.e., an epic fantasy with magic, but then the girl in your sci-fi trilogy comes from an island on the world on which the epic fantasy takes place?
I don't personally do that because I never even thought about doing that, but I think readers freaking love that stuff.
It's similar. I've not done that myself, but readers do love finding the interconnections between things. If you do something like that. Not even just readers, movies and games have done that too, and fans just love it because they're like, oh, especially if that little island was their favorite place in that book, and then you're Sci-Fi 1,000 years later, someone's like, I'm from this island. They're like, I love that place. This person is my new favorite character forever. Like, because they've already got that instant connection. But I've not done something like that myself, and at least not off the top of my head, but it's something, and it's certainly something you can do. It's just fun.
Edge Dance asks, how much would you have to do in the world building part when your character is visiting a whole bunch of foreign worlds all for a short time?
I would say only world build what the reader has to know, A, and B, what your character sees and experiences while visiting these worlds. It's too much otherwise, and we don't need the rest.
In some ways, I think it's actually less world building. It's like Star Trek The Next Generation versus DS9. Like, if you're doing a planet a week, you do some really like shallow world building, whereas with DS9, as they're on a space station, you have to have this really complex, deep, coherent world building, because otherwise people would start asking questions. So I don't think that's actually an insurmountable task to have short visits that in and of that's kind of like you're writing a short story each time, to have glimpses into worlds that are coherent. Making a city or a civilization that can withstand lots and lots of text in many ways takes more world building, because you have to look at more parts of society.
Yeah.
I guess the only thing I would add is if you're planning on coming back to them later, then and there's going to be something significant in there to a plot, make sure you've sketched that out. But otherwise, just what they see and what's going to be immediately important, and then you can just off you go to the next destination, which does kind of give you a lot of freedom to make something really wild and bizarre if you want to, which can be pretty fun.
Lynn's asks if the panelists will be able to stay and answer more questions in the chat, and I'll leave that up to you guys. It's 9:15. We just have a couple more questions that already appeared in the chat before I kind of drew a line.
We offered a willingness and they accepted.
Oh,
you gave them an inch. This is really awesome. M. Furs asks, have you ever wanted to retcon something you came up with in something you already published? If so, how did you deal with that?
Can someone define retcon for me? This is embarrassing, but
retcon is when you want to when you want to rewrite it. You want to change it.
Okay. I assumed by context, but I was like, I'm going to answer this question, and they're going to be like, that's not what that word meant. Okay, go ahead, Max.
Actually, yes. I tried. So I generally write everything out start to finish, and then that's it. And I tried an experiment this last summer for the year of 2020. So it's fitting the way I see it, the way it turned out it did, where I wrote an episodic story, and I posted it one episode per every other week on my website as I wrote it. And let me tell you, I have quite a bit of respect for the people that do serial work like that, because I was just, by the end, I was like, I don't like this. I do not like this at all. Like, I started sliding back into overarching plot and everything, but it made it, I couldn't do anything when the option came up because the readers had already seen it. It was already out there. Retcons can really throw readers off, because it's like you've handed them a bone and said, this will be important later. But the next time you bring it up, you go, actually, that wasn't a bone. That was a board. And it's actually half the length. And I lied. I'm really sorry. It was a mistake, but you just got to forget what I told you. Fandoms don't really like that. It throws them out. It reminds them that it's a story and not their friends experiencing something. And when I ran into it, I had no choice. I just had to, I already said it like this. I'm just going to have to find a new route. And so that's what I did, which made it really difficult. But if it's already out there in the world, you can retcon it. There are several book series I know of, the Halo books. The initial books, when they were written, had no insight from the story team at all. They just handed it off to an author and said, here, write about this. And they ended up making up a bunch of stuff that years later, the game people were like, no, none of that is what we would have done. So they retconned the books and they republished them. And to this day, if you want to start a fight in a Halo fandom, walk into any of their forums and go, the retcon was better. And like mods will show up. Like those are fighting words. Yeah, retconning. This is why my advice is get it all figured out. But if you're looking at your first book in your trilogy and you're on your third, you need to retcon something, you're kind of too late. You should probably just figure out a way around it. Find a detour. That would be my advice.
Yeah, my answer is no, that I have not. Have I wished that I could rewrite stuff just because the writing would be better, like the prose in general? Absolutely, because you learn. But the one thing that I do that I think helps this problem for me, and I recommend it for anyone who can do it, as an author, anytime you make a decision about anything, even the stupid random stuff that you drop, you have to think about it, like the implications from start to finish. Like if I add this or do this or have this character have this personality trait or this magical ability or whatever, how does that impact the world from now and to here on and forever? And I know it sounds like a big question, and it kind of is, but I go down that path. Like I'm like, this would mean this would mean this, da, 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 da. Am I okay with all of this? And if the answer is yes, do I need to adjust anything to make that happen? And if the answer is no, we drop it and we pick up something else that won't have the fallout that I didn't like. So I take the time to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add. I haven't really retconned anything. I think it's valuable if you're planning a series to, outline the next couple books so you'll know the major plot things you have. I have gone back into drafts that weren't published and like, oh yeah, I need to set this thing up first and added that. So I think taking that extra time, if you're planning on writing more, even if you don't write it out, to think like, where am I going to take this? So that you can have that built into the first thing. So you give yourself that opportunity to fly is time well spent.
Okay, last question.
We did it.
Yay!
Only because she cut it off, though.
They are still going. I mean, they're not adding questions, but I did cut it off. But they are still posting.
I have to go over and say hello if I can figure out how to. Oh,
I will help you out with that.
Okay.
Bookmarked one asks, how do you avoid tropes in your world building?
Okay. I think that there are tropes and you have to be careful. However, I also feel like it's one of those pieces of advice that has been so overkilled that now everybody is scared to do anything. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like I put dragons and magic in my fantasy. I mean, if we want to get real technical, it's kind of a trope, but make it original to you and it looks slightly less tropey. Put your author voice in there all of the way. And I think it will help. But yeah, I tend to, I guess, advise slightly on the don't freak out about that as much. Because otherwise nobody writes anything. Because they're like, oh, it's a trope. And oh, that's been done. And of course it is. Everything. It's all been done. All of it.
So, okay, when people say, like, that's an info dump, that's a flavor of boredom. If someone says, like, that writing is really tropey, that means it looks like lazy writing. We had a beautiful keynote yesterday or today, all time is the same, about interrogating your imagination and just thinking, like, how can I make this interesting? Fantasy and sci-fi readers love building. Like, that's why we're here. So if you have someone be like, oh, that's such a trope, like, think about it. Like, how can I make this different? How can I make this better? It's impossible to write writing without tropes. Like, humans eat food and talk over food. It's a trope, but like, that's just going to be in all my books. I like writing about food. It's necessary for the vomit
Which is
scene.
why there's so much vomiting.
Anyway, So yeah, when you hear that, when people say, "Oh, that's tropey," what they really mean is that feels lazy. It feels like a Xerox of someone else's work. So think about how to make that creative and engaging and fresh again. You can't write without tropes, and tropes can be really useful too. Max.
Yeah, when I hear this question, I usually think I hear a voice in my head that goes, "I want to build a building without blueprints and without any building materials." Is using the trope the same way everybody else has without any variation. But you don't have to do that. You can use the shovel to dig a hole, or you can use the shovel to dig a hole, have your character dig a hole for their own grave, or you can use the shovel to beat the bad guy over the head with. Tropes are always going to be there. You will never, if any dedicated tropers want to trope your book, they could fill a Wikipedia page on it. Don't worry about it. Just write a story that to you is unique and fun and clever, and it won't matter. It'll be full of tropes. Maybe they'll name one after you. You'll invent a new one that everybody else wants to start doing. It happens. It may not be as original as everyone thinks, because again, nothing new under the sun, only new approaches. So just don't worry about it.
And I just want to point like a huge arrow to what Megan said, because it was perfect. Because she said that the trope is just another word for lazy writing, right? So if someone says to you, "Oh, this is a trope," one, decide if their opinion matters, because sometimes people offer opinions without actually knowing what they're talking about. So make sure we've got some good opinions coming in, but then don't just throw it away. Like, don't be like, "Oh, well, I can't write the story about that," or "I can't write that scene about that." Go in and do it better.
Own it.
Thank you so much for being here, you guys. Would you like to do a little wrap up, summarize, last thought?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess I should tell you where to find me, huh? So my name is Weird. So I am my name everywhere. So DevriWalls.com, Devri Walls on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, all the things. Just Devri Walls. DEV as in Victor, RI. Come find me, come chat with me, check out Vinators because it's a lot of fun. And that's all I got.
Megan, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm under MK Hutchins everywhere. So that's my website, mkhutchins.com, and I'm at MK Hutchins on Twitter. And I write things, and this was really fun.
I am Max Florschutz. I do science fiction and fantasy. I had an absolute blast doing this. I would highly encourage anybody who's looking for more and wants to get some really detailed stuff on this. My website is, I've been doing Being a Better Writer every Monday for like 6 years. It's maxonwriting.com. And while you're there, you can check out this fantastic book about a dragoness who wants to become a banker, which is just great. So thank you for attending. I had an absolute blast. This was great.